A woman with epilepsy was threatened with a $50,000 fine for living in a tiny home next to her father. A couple on the New South Wales south coast is facing compliance exposure of up to $1 million for building a small home on their own land. I know those numbers sound impossible. They aren't. They are documented enforcement actions from 2025, and they are the result of legal mechanisms that have been on the books in 4 Australian states for decades. Nobody told you about them. This isn't fringe activism or a niche dispute between a single stubborn homeowner and a petty council officer. The enforcement actions you're about to hear span 4 separate Australian states, involve at least 6 distinct families, and are backed by specific clauses in active legislation. These aren't policy proposals being debated in committee. They are instruments being used right now. Realestate.com.au and Domain won't tell you any of this. Neither will the real estate agent who sold you the block. What you're about to see is a legal pattern. Each state has its own mechanism. Each mechanism has its own enforcement event from 2020 or later. And they are not slowing down. They are escalating. Start with what sounds like a reasonable question. If you own land in Victoria and you want to put a small structure on it to live in, what do you need? The answer, under the Building Act 1993 Section 16, is a building permit. That applies to any structure designed, constructed or adapted for occupation as a building on private land. It doesn't matter if it's 80 square metres or 18. It doesn't matter if you plan to stay permanently or temporarily. The moment that structure qualifies as a building under the Act, the full weight of the National Construction Code comes down on it, and there's no statewide owner-builder exemption for small rural dwellings. That's the part that catches people off guard. In other jurisdictions, there are carved-out pathways for small, self-built structures in rural zones. Victoria doesn't offer one. You go through the same permit process as someone building a 4-bedroom house in a suburban subdivision. Inspections, engineering certificates, energy efficiency compliance, the whole sequence. The enforcement case that put this on the map involved Evrim Sen and Benny Redfern in Belgrave South in the Yarra Ranges. Yarra Ranges Council served them a building order, demanding demolition unless they could demonstrate building code compliance. Their structure, a small dwelling on their own private land, was flagged as a building erected without a permit under the Act. The order didn't leave much room for negotiation. Comply with the building code or pull it down. Sen put the structural problem plainly. Speaking to ABC News in July 2025, he said, "The dwelling is on wheels, and it's never going to meet the building codes in that manner. That's the practical reality. A tiny home on wheels cannot be retrofitted into a Building Act compliant structure without ceasing to be what it was built to be. The Council's order doesn't acknowledge that constraint. It treats compliance and demolition as the only 2 options." Now there is a mitigant here, and it's worth being honest about it. The Building Appeals Board ruled in March 2025 that a tiny home on wheels, if it is registrable as a caravan, is not a building under the Building Act. That's a real pathway. But here's what that ruling does not fix. Planning requirements still apply independently of the building permit question. Getting past the building classification doesn't clear the planning hurdle. You can win on the Building Act argument and still face a planning enforcement notice from the same council. Yarra Ranges Council framed its position in a statement to Mirage News on 14 July 2025. Council officers work closely with owners and occupants to explain permit requirements. That is the council's framing, explanation and engagement. The owner's framing is a building order demanding demolition. Both are on the public record. That's what makes Victoria's setup structurally different from a simple permit problem. You're not dealing with one gate. You're dealing with 2 gates in sequence, operated by different parts of the regulatory system. Clear the first one, and the second one is still locked. The March 2025 ruling gives owners of Tho-style builds a real argument, but it's a partial argument, and partial in a demolition order context means you're still in the room with the council's lawyers. The rental context around this matters too. Victoria's housing market has been under pressure for years. Regional areas like the Yarra Ranges, where Belgrave South sits, have seen demand for affordable rural accommodation intensify as Melbourne's outer suburbs become less accessible to younger buyers. The people building tiny homes in these areas are not, by and large, doing it as a lifestyle statement. They are doing it because conventional housing on that land is financially out of reach. The Building Act's permit requirements don't acknowledge that reality. They apply the same compliance framework regardless of the economic conditions driving the decision to build small. What Victoria demonstrates is this: a well-intentioned regulatory structure designed for conventional construction becomes a blunt instrument when applied to non-conventional housing. And when councils start using that instrument, as Yarra Ranges did, the outcome is a demolition order against a family on their own land. That's not a hypothetical risk. It already happened. The date on the order is on record. You've just seen a state where a tiny homeowner won a partial legal ruling in March 2025 and still faces planning enforcement. The next state doesn't leave that ambiguity open. There, the cap on how long you can legally occupy your own tiny home on vacant land is 2 weeks per year. And when 4 families exceeded it, the council didn't send a warning letter. Queensland's mechanism isn't a building code. It's a time limit. Specifically, it's Schedule 7 of the Sunshine Coast Subordinate Local Law No. 1, Administration, 2016. And what it does is cap temporary home occupation. On vacant land, the cap is 2 weeks per 52-week period without approval. Behind an existing dwelling, it expands slightly, 4 weeks per 52-week period. Past those thresholds, you need a permit. And the permit fee runs $587 Australian. I know a 2-week annual cap on living in your own structure on your own land sounds like something that couldn't possibly be enforced in practice. It is. The maximum approval period for a caravan or mobile home under this framework is 18 months. Not permanent, not indefinite. 18 months, then you apply again or you leave. The enforcement event that made this concrete happened in June 2023 at a property in Belly Park, a rural locality on the Sunshine Coast hinterland. 4 tiny home families were living on the property. Sunshine Coast Council served an eviction notice and removed them. Not 1 family, 4. The enforcement action was coordinated, not incidental, and during the process, a Sunshine Coast Council spokesperson made the per-property cap explicit, telling ABC News, only 1 tiny home can be located on a property. You could have 40 acres, the cap is still 1. For the families on the property, the consequences were immediate. One of the affected residents, Angela Smith, told ABC News, "I don't have a backup plan." That single sentence captures the position the council's enforcement framework puts people in. No notice period long enough to arrange alternatives. No financial cushion. No replacement housing. Then, in October 2024, the council issued a follow-up enforcement notice ordering decommission. The same property, the same issue. The June 2023 eviction had not resolved the matter permanently, or the residents had returned and the council came back a second time. Either way, the October 2024 notice represents a second documented enforcement action against the same site within 16 months. The per-property cap deserves a moment's attention because it's the detail that collapses the usual workaround. The typical response to tight zoning rules on tiny homes is, find more land. Buy rural acreage, put your tiny home there, stay off the suburban grid. Queensland's per-property rule closes that door. The land area is irrelevant. The number that matters is 1 tiny home per property under current council policy. A large rural block and a small suburban lot face the same restriction. The honest mitigant is that the Sunshine Coast's local law framework does provide an approval pathway. The $587 permit fee and the 18-month maximum approval exist, which means the process isn't a flat prohibition. A family willing to navigate the application process and accept a time-limited approval can operate within the rules. But operate within the rules here means a temporary occupancy permit that expires, a renewal requirement, a per-property cap that prevents any kind of communal or multi-family arrangement, and a compliance environment where 2 separate enforcement actions have been documented at a single site. Queensland's broader rental market context adds weight to this. The Sunshine Coast has been one of Australia's fastest-growing regional property markets. Median house prices in the area have risen significantly over the past 5 years, pricing out households that were previously able to afford regional coastal living. Tiny home living on rural Sunshine Coast land is not a fringe experiment. It's a direct response to a housing access problem that the conventional market hasn't solved. The subordinate local law isn't designed to address that problem. it predates it, and it's being enforced against the people it's affecting most directly. Ask anyone who lived through the Belly Park eviction and they'll tell you the same thing. There was no ambiguity about what the council intended to do. The June 2023 action wasn't a procedural warning, it was a removal. 4 families, their homes, their land, their arrangement, and the council arrived with a timeline and an enforcement notice. That's Queensland's tiny home reality in 2026. So far, the enforcement has involved demolition orders and family evictions. The next state adds a medical dimension the council explicitly chose to ignore. The threatened fine there is $50,000, and the person facing it has epilepsy, a fact the council had on record when the notice went out. Western Australia's regulatory mechanism is the oldest one in this group. The Caravan Parks and Camping Grounds Regulations 1997, yes, 1997, under Regulations 10, 11, 11A and 11B, prohibit permanent caravan occupation outside an approved caravan park or camping ground. Permanent occupation on private land is simply not permitted under this framework. The updated WA Planning Commission Tiny Houses Fact Sheet, issued in December 2024, reinforced exactly that position, making clear that nothing in the intervening decades had changed the fundamental rule. The maximum permitted stay without any approval is 5 nights. With written approval from the local government or the minister, that extends to 24 months. Not permanently, 24 months, and then the approval ends. The structure of the regulation treats a tiny home on a private residential block the same way it treats a tent in a campground, a temporary accommodation arrangement that requires authorisation to extend beyond a very short window. The enforcement case that defines Western Australia's position involves Catherine Payne and the city of Wanneroo. Payne has epilepsy. She chose to live in a tiny home on her father's property, specifically in the front yard adjacent to her father's house, so that she would be physically close to a family member in the event of a seizure. That's not a lifestyle choice. That's a safety arrangement built around a medical condition. The city of Wanneroo demanded she remove the tiny home anyway. The threatened fine? 50,000 Australias. Payne described what the order meant for her, telling ABC News in October 2025, "I feel like my life has just been pulled right out from underneath me." The council's response, issued through the same reporting, was procedural. The city applies these laws consistently and fairly to maintain community safety and protect the rights of all residents. That is the council's framing: consistency and fairness. Payne's framing: life pulled out from underneath her. Both statements are on the same record, attached to the same enforcement action. The council's position was not that Payne's situation wasn't real, or that her medical condition wasn't documented. The council's position was that the Caravan Parks and Camping Grounds regulations applied regardless. The regulation doesn't include a medical exemption clause, it doesn't include a family proximity exemption clause, it doesn't include a hardship exemption clause. It applies, and the enforcement mechanism applies with it. Council action proceeded despite the health vulnerability being on record. That's the sentence that should stay with you, not the fine amount, though $50,000 is not a minor penalty. The operative fact is that the council knew about the medical context, and the enforcement action proceeded anyway. The WA regulatory framework, as currently written, does not give local government the discretion to carve out exceptions for medical necessity. Either the regulation applies, or it doesn't. In Wanneroo, it applied. The December 2024 WA Planning Commission fact sheet is worth reading closely if you're in WA and thinking about a tiny home. It is not a guidance document that identifies pathways. It is a document that reconfirms restrictions. Its primary function is to clarify that the 1997 regulations remain in force and that the permanent caravan prohibition is not a legacy technicality, it is current policy. The fact sheet arrived at a moment when tiny home advocacy groups were arguing loudly for reform, and what the Planning Commission produced was a document that said, in effect, the rules are what they are. The honest mitigant for Western Australia is that the 24-month approval pathway exists. A written application to the local government or the minister can unlock a 2-year temporary occupancy window. That's not nothing. For someone in a transitional housing situation, waiting for a bill to be completed, managing a short-term financial crisis, 2 years of approved caravan occupation on private land is a workable arrangement. But workable arrangement and permanent home on your own land are different things. And for Catherine Payne, the arrangement she needed wasn't temporary. It was ongoing medical safety. The 24-month approval pathway doesn't solve that. It defers the problem. Western Australia's rental market context is as acute as anywhere in the country. Perth's vacancy rate has been among the lowest of any Australian capital for several years running. Regional WA is under parallel pressure. People are building tiny homes on family land, not because it's fashionable, but because the alternative, paying market rent in a market with near zero vacancy, is financially crushing. The 1997 regulation isn't responding to that reality. It predates it by almost 3 decades, and in 2026, it is still being enforced with 5-figure fines against a woman living next to her father for medical reasons. That's the gap between the regulation and the people it's hitting. New South Wales is where the numbers stop being uncomfortable and start being serious. The regulatory instrument is the Local Government Manufactured Home Estates, Caravan Parks, Camping Grounds and Movable Dwellings Regulation 2021, Schedule 7. What it does is limit caravan or campervan occupation without approval to 2 consecutive days and 60 days in any 12-month period. Past that threshold, you need approval under Section 68 of the Local Government Act 1993. There is no owner-build exception. There is no rural land exception. There is no "it's my property" exception. 2 consecutive days. Let that land for a second. Not 2 weeks like Queensland, not 5 nights like Western Australia. 2 consecutive days before you need formal approval to stay in a structure on your own land. I know that sounds like it can't be right. It is. It is verbatim in Schedule 7 of a regulation that came into force in 2021 and has been actively enforced since. The enforcement record in New South Wales is not a single case. It is a documented pattern spanning 2 separate councils at opposite ends of the state within a 2-year window, both pursuing demolition orders and substantial financial penalties. The first case, Byron Shire Council, 2023. Matt Bruce built a tiny home on his property on the New South Wales north coast. Byron Shire pursued a demolition order. A $9,000 fine was issued to Bruce's landlord as part of the enforcement action. Bruce's account of what was at stake, given to The Guardian in September 2023, was direct. "It's my life savings. It's all I have." That is the financial context Byron Shire's enforcement action was being applied against. The council's mayor at the time, Michael Lyon, defended the council's position by telling The Guardian, "We cannot allow precedents of development in prohibited zones or it becomes open slather." 2 statements, same enforcement file. One frames the action as life savings under threat. The other frames it as a precedent that must not be set. Byron Shire has been one of Australia's most high-profile battlegrounds for alternative housing, and the council's enforcement record there is well documented. The second case, Bega Valley Shire Council, August 2025. Josh Hines and Manu Bon were ordered to remove their tiny home from their property on the New South Wales south coast. The matter didn't stop at a council notice. It escalated to the New South Wales Land and Environment Court, and the compliance exposure in that matter, the maximum financial risk attached to the enforcement action, has been reported at up to $1 million. Think about those 2 numbers together. A $9,000 fine in Byron in 2023, a $1 million compliance exposure in Bega Valley in 2025, both under the same regulatory framework, both in New South Wales, both involving people who built small structures on land they had legal access to. The geographic spread is the detail that changes the interpretation of these cases. Byron Shire sits on the far north coast of New South Wales, roughly 800 kilometres from Bega Valley on the south coast. These are not neighbouring councils making coordinated policy decisions. They are different local government areas with different council compositions, different demographics, and different political environments. The fact that both independently pursued enforcement against tiny homeowners within 2 years of each other, both using the same underlying regulation, is not a coincidence of local politics. It's evidence that the 2021 regulation is doing exactly what it was designed to do, statewide, consistently. When locals in the alternative housing community talk about New South Wales, the phrase you hear repeatedly is regulatory consistency. What they mean by that, in practice, is that there's nowhere to hide within the state's borders. Victoria has the March 2025 Appeals Board ruling that creates a partial caravan classification argument. Queensland has an approval pathway that, while limited, exists. Western Australia has the 24-month ministerial approval route. New South Wales has the 2021 regulation, active enforcement in multiple regions, and a land and environment court case with 7-figure exposure. The mitigants are thinner. The honest mitigant for New South Wales is that the Section 68 approval pathway exists. Local councils can grant approval for movable dwelling occupation, and some have been more flexible than others in interpreting the conditions. In certain rural shires with acute housing pressure, informal tolerance has been reported by residents who've managed to stay under the radar. But staying under the radar is not a regulatory mitigant. It's an absence of enforcement, and the Bega Valley case, a rural shire, not a high-density urban council, demonstrates that rural location alone does not insulate a tiny homeowner from enforcement action. The Land and Environment Court escalation in the Bega Valley case is significant beyond the financial exposure it creates. The LEC is not a local government mediation body. It is a specialist court with jurisdiction over planning, environment, and local government law in New South Wales. Cases that reach the LEC have moved past the council notice stage, past the internal review stage, and into formal litigation. When a tiny homeowner situation reaches the LEC, the cost of legal defence alone, before any fine or order is considered, is substantial. For households that chose tiny home living precisely because conventional housing was financially inaccessible, the prospect of LEC litigation is not just a legal problem, it is a financial catastrophe. Here's what the New South Wales regulatory picture looks like from the outside, if you're someone considering a tiny home on land you own or lease in that state. The 2021 regulation caps your unapproved occupancy at 60 days per year. The approval process under Section 68 is council-dependent and not uniformly accessible. 2 councils in geographically distant parts of the state have pursued demolition orders and court action against tiny homeowners within the last 3 years. One of those cases has reached a court with jurisdiction to impose penalties approaching $1 million, and the state government has not issued any guidance that suggests reform is imminent. New South Wales has one of the most severe rental shortages of any Australian jurisdiction. Sydney's rental vacancy rate has been below 2% for an extended period, and regional New South Wales, coastal, inland and highland areas alike, has absorbed enormous demand displacement from people priced out of the city. The people building tiny homes in Byronshire and Bega Valley are not doing it as an experiment. They are doing it because the alternative is unaffordable, unavailable, or both. The 2021 regulation doesn't engage with that reality. It was written to govern caravan parks and camping grounds, and it is being applied, in full, with court enforcement, against people who are using the only housing solution available to them. That's the gap. And in New South Wales, right now, that gap has a 7-figure number attached to it. Residents who've navigated the New South Wales system and come out the other side, the ones who found an approval pathway or negotiated a settlement with their council, will tell you the same thing. The process is exhausting, expensive, and entirely dependent on which council you're dealing with and which officer picks up your file. There is no uniform pathway. There is no predictable outcome. There is a regulation that caps your occupancy at 2 consecutive days without approval, and there are councils that are actively using it. In at least 2 documented cases since 2023, they've used it all the way to demolition orders and specialist court proceedings. The pattern across all 4 states is the same. Regulations written for caravan parks and conventional construction are being applied in full against families whose only crime is building small on land they own. The mechanisms are decades old, the enforcement is current. The gap between the law and the housing reality keeps widening. Which of these 4 states surprises you most? And do you think any of them have a legitimate case for the restriction they're enforcing? Leave it in the comments. If this kind of regulatory breakdown is what you're here for, subscribe. There's more of this that isn't making the news.